So we made it to the end of this wonderful Bible reading journey together through the book of Ruth. A couple of times Mark and I have been able to read books of the Bible together, and I usually really enjoy it. Not as much Romans, but the narrative ones, like Ruth and Jonah and the Gospels, because I think it helps us see a bigger picture of the story if you can read it in order and you can read it all together. Because we often just get bits and pieces of God's story, and it makes it harder to see the larger consistent themes of God throughout the Bible. So let's continue to look at Ruth. So far in this story, we've learned that Naomi moved away from her home in Bethlehem, the future city of David, also called the house of bread or food, which she left because of famine. Ironic. Then after her sons get married to women in the region, Moabites, not a Jewish mother's top pick for in-laws, but her sons and even her own husband pass away. So chapter 1 clearly places us in famine, physically and emotionally. But the hopeful end of that chapter is one of her daughters-in-laws, Ruth, pledges to stay with Naomi. Naomi, whose experience tells her that God has abandoned and forsaken her, and yet even in the midst of that, she is presented with a foreigner who offers her deep faithfulness and loyalty that closely mirrors God's own faithfulness to us. In the next chapter, we learn of how precarious Ruth and Naomi's situation is as widows with no men in their lives, revealing an unequal and unsafe society, not as different from today as we would like to believe. But Ruth is proactive and begins gleaning and gathering leftover grain from one of the fields with the hope that someone will be nice to her. And somebody is, a man named Boaz. Interestingly, Boaz was born out of an undesirable situation himself. The son of Tamar, who was required to seduce her own father-in-law, dressed provocatively, to ensure her own safety. So maybe Boaz had a deeper appreciation for the plight of a widow woman like Ruth. He invites her to his table and promises her protection to glean his fields. And once again, he acts mostly in a God-loving justice kind of way. It would have been even better if he had spoken out and acted towards all women getting this kind of protection, not just the ones he knew. So now we're finally in chapter 3 at the end of the harvest season, and nothing has happened. Ruth and Naomi's situation has not really changed. And as we're reading, Naomi makes a terrible suggestion that reveals just how limited and dangerous the choices can be for women. Exit my daughter. Who is not enjoying the sermon at all. Naomi suggests that Ruth get herself gussied up so that she can go secretly visit Boaz on the threshing floor, and he will tell you what to do. This is one of those moments in which the Bible, and I'm going to be real clear, is not an instruction book. The story is telling you how things were back then for widowed women, but not suggesting that this would ever be okay. Maybe the authors are even suggesting to the readers that this situation should be dramatically different for the vulnerable. And then, in another terrible turn, Ruth agrees to do what Naomi's told her to do. She gets dressed and perfumed up, sneaks onto the threshing floor unseen, gets next to Boaz and uncovers him so that it looks like something had happened the night before. But it is actually when he wakes up that Ruth goes off script. Because before he can tell her what to do, she tells him what he needs to do, which is to really and fully protect both her and Naomi by marrying Ruth. And amazingly, this works. Boaz agrees to marry her but then also pulls some kind of shady stuff with a piece of land we didn't know happened to exist to Naomi. It belonged to her husband, and there suddenly appears another kinsman that we hadn't heard about. He doesn't even get named. The word they use for him in the scripture is, they call him just some so-and-so. And then once this is over, Boaz makes the formal declaration that everything's going to be okay. Ruth will be married. Naomi will have protection of Boaz because of Ruth. And this is where the story could have just ended. But then God shows up. Now, this book has been all over the place when it's come to God. People have blamed God and credited God and asked for God's blessing. But if we're paying close attention, where is it that we see God really act in the story? God gets mentioned a few places in the first chapter. Naomi returns to Bethlehem because she had heard that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. That's what she'd heard. In the same chapter, Naomi hopes that the Lord will deal kindly with her daughters-in-law, even though she said the Lord had turned against her. She offers a lament to God at the end of that chapter, stating that he had dealt harshly with her and brought calamity upon her. By chapter 2, it's Boaz hoping that the Lord will reward Ruth for her deeds, and he credits God with protecting both her and Naomi. In chapter, Naomi praises God for apparently now not forsaking them. And finally, in chapter 3, Boaz hopes the Lord will bless Ruth for pursuing him instead of going after younger men. So lots of complaining, bringing calamity when circumstances were dire, asking for God's blessing and assuming God's action when things started to look better. So, like I said, all over the place. But it's not until the last part of the last chapter that the author of Ruth confirms an action of God. And that's the part of the story we're going to read today. Now, each week Dave has asked someone else from the congregation to read for a volunteer. I'm going to do the same thing. I promise there are no difficult names. There we go. You want to come up here? Oh, all right. Chapter 4, you're 13 through 17, right there. I know it's small. Are you going to be okay?
I think.
All right. Take your time.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and made his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him."
No, you're right.
Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, the father of David.
Thank you very much. I know, we should start doing this more often. People are really good at this. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Now, although the title of the book we've been reading is Ruth, and she's the person God directly acts upon, the more I read this book, I realize this is actually Naomi's story. Because it's about her journey. It's about her redemption, her salvation, her learning and discovering that God can and has, in fact, made her new. We know that God has been doing this redeeming, remembering, rescuing, liberating for a while. It's kind of God's thing. But we forget. Just like Naomi. It slips from our brains and our hearts when we watch the news. When we marvel at humanity's ability to cause suffering. When we learn of tragic stories of loss and pain and illness and systems that seem just too broken and we forget, or if I'm really honest, we doubt that God can change and transform our messes because they seem too big. That we can become like Naomi in chapter 1, bitter and sad and frustrated. And I will have to admit, earlier in the week, working on this sermon, that's a little bit where I was. And yet, it was also my week to preach, not chapter 1, but chapter 4. I get the final act of the story in the midst of my own doubt and worries. And it happens to be my job to tell the story of what God does for Naomi. Coincidence? I think not. And what I discover is in the midst of this messy story, with messy, imperfect people, God still acts. And what we learn is that what had seemed impossible for Naomi at the beginning, just a few years earlier, the idea that she could ever be safe and secure, have a family, let alone a grandchild, is made possible by God by the end of the story. God does the impossible. And God didn't erase or change her earlier circumstances, but instead breaks through that grief and that bitterness and our disbelief and makes Naomi and us new anyways. Nadia Boltz-Weber, a Lutheran pastor out in Colorado, talks about this idea and explains it like this. New doesn't always look perfect. Like the gospel story itself, new is often messy. New looks like recovering alcoholics. New looks like reconciliation between family members who don't actually deserve it. New looks like every time I manage to admit I was wrong, and every time I manage not to mention when I'm right. New looks like every fresh start and every act of forgiveness and every moment of letting go of what we thought we couldn't live without, and then somehow live without it anyways. New is the thing we never saw coming, never even hoped for, but ends up being what we needed all along. And when reading Ruth, I think sometimes new looks like a bitter, sad, sometimes manipulative widow holding her first grandchild. It looks like a woman who believed her life was over, being surrounded by the women of Bethlehem, shouting praises to God on her behalf, listing her blessings. They won't let her ignore what God has done for her. And as we've heard in previous weeks, this is not just any grandchild, but the next in line of children that will lead to King David and ultimately to Jesus. God has done a huge new thing, moving in ways to make all things new. One more step in reconciling all of creation. And when I hear this story, it's a relief and a release that we are not the ones fully responsible for this to happen. If we're lucky, we get to participate like Ruth when we offer loyalty and love to those who are grieving and lost. We can move closer to God's kingdom when we live out and speak out and act out to create a more just world for women and children and all people who are currently vulnerable, like Boaz did. But it is God who does the messy work of redemption and salvation and redeeming and liberating and of making the world and each one of us new. Thank God.